You sit cloaked in silk that does not feel like your own. The chamber is dim, heavy with the bite of sandalwood smoke that catches in your throat. Brass ornaments along the walls glint faintly, their chill seeping through the air like silent witnesses. Outside, muffled chanting rises and falls, prayers or perhaps warnings. Tonight was supposed to be the first night of closeness, of whispered tenderness, but the bed you face is not yours to claim. It is an altar, and you are not alone. Elders hover in the shadows, priests with ledgers in hand, attendants whispering rules you must obey. Every gesture is judged, every breath measured. A moment of hesitation will mark you as impure, defective, dangerous to the order that rules beyond these walls. Failure means not just shame, but exile, perhaps death. This is no sanctuary of love. This is a battlefield of discipline. And though the poets sang of beauty, mathematics, and eternal truths, the same civilization also perfected rules that turned intimacy into a weapon of control. If this glimpse into the shadows grips you, subscribe now and drop a comment on where you're watching from. It fuels more unearthings like this and helps bring forgotten voices back from the dust. Across centuries, from the Maurya to the Gupta, the subcontinent thrived as one of the world's great powers. Empires commanding millions, building temples that touched the sky, refining sciences and philosophies that endure today. Yet beneath the grandeur, hidden in manuscripts and temple records, lay rules that invaded the most private of spaces. These were not the accidents of eccentric kings or isolated customs. They were deliberate, systematic, institutionalized controls over the body and the bedroom. Ancient texts, like the Manusmriti and Arthashastra, alongside inscriptions and travelers' chronicles from Megasthenes to Xuanzang, reveal a world where intimacy was watched, measured, and weaponized as a tool of empire. The night of the bridal chamber was only the beginning. Ancient India's bedroom rules were not whispers of private choice. They were codified in scripture, sanctioned by law, and enforced with a precision that shocks us even now. At the heart of it all was the idea that intimacy was not personal, but political. What a man did with his wife, or what a woman dared to resist, could ripple across caste lines, unsettle dynasties, and even destabilize kingdoms. The Manusmriti, a foundational law book written between 200 BCE and 200 CE, declared bluntly, a woman must never be independent. At birth she was under her father, in marriage under her husband, and in widowhood under her sons. What sounded like guidance was in truth surveillance, for independence was equated with danger. The most vulnerable arena for such control was the bedroom. To touch, to speak, even to desire outside prescribed rules was not sin. It was treason against the social order. On the surface, rituals carried the poetry of devotion. A bride was bathed in scented waters, her skin rubbed with turmeric, her hair oiled and braided, her body adorned in silk. But beneath the fragrance was an inspection, sometimes literal. Elders and midwives were tasked to confirm her virginity. Inscriptions from temple towns describe purity rites, where young brides were examined not in private, but in ceremonial fashion, with the family's reputation and the woman's fate hanging on the outcome. Failure meant rejection. A girl declared impure might be disowned, sold, or forced into servitude at a temple as a devadasi, a euphemism that sanctified exploitation under the guise of divine service. The Arthashastra, written by Kautilya, the famed advisor to Chandragupta Maurya, was even more clinical. It treated women as state resources. Concubines of the king, he advised, should be carefully trained and monitored by older attendants. They were to be recorded in ledgers with details of their cycles, pregnancies, and duties. A wife, too, was not merely a partner but a vessel for producing heirs, with rules that governed when intimacy could occur, at what hours, even on which nights of the lunar calendar. Failure to perform, the text warned, could be grounds for punishment or divorce, but only for the woman. Systematic control bled into punishments that were both brutal and humiliating. If a wife was suspected of infidelity, her hair could be shorn, her body paraded naked through the village, her face branded with hot iron. Some accounts from the Dharmashastras describe banishment into forests, left to starve or depend on charity. The man, by contrast, often paid a fine and resumed his life. The message was clear: the bedroom was a theater of law, and the woman its stage, whether she wished to perform or not. Travelers bore witness to this system. The Greek ambassador Megasthenes, visiting the Mauryan court in the 3rd century BCE, marveled at the sophistication of Indian governance, but also noted the harsh regulation of family life. Centuries later, the Chinese monk Xuanzang recorded temple practices where women were given as offerings, described euphemistically as flowers of devotion. The phrase concealed the reality. These were young girls compelled into sexual servitude, their intimacy transformed into state-sanctioned ritual. The horror lay in its organization. Unlike the chaos of war rape, this was a bureaucracy of control. Temple inscriptions list women not by name, but by age and condition. 5 maidens, 14 years of age, suitable for service. They are tallied beside donations of rice and gold. The ledgers made no distinction between food, livestock, and flesh. Such records, carved in stone, tell us this was not aberration, it was system, and it was profitable. Families too poor to pay taxes could offer their daughters to temples or nobles. Military commanders were rewarded not only with land but with women, listed as household additions. Entire caravans transported brides as dowry exchanges, with survival rates scarcely noted. One inscription from the Deccan speaks of 50 women carried as gifts to a ruler, 20 are marked as dead by the time of delivery, their loss recorded no differently than spoiled grain. Even the much-celebrated Kama Sutra was not free of this shadow. Though often romanticized in the West as a manual of pleasure, its context reveals something colder. The text is not simply about love, but about managing wives, concubines, and courtesans. It classifies women, advises on their training, and warns men to guard them carefully from other men's advances. Here, too, intimacy is framed as a resource, to be cultivated, consumed, and controlled, not shared. Psychological warfare played a role just as brutal as the physical. Widows bore the heaviest burden. Stripped of ornaments, their heads shaved, clothed in plain white, they were made symbols of desolation. Their existence was a warning to younger women. Loyalty must extend beyond death. By the medieval period, this logic crystallized into sati, the ritual burning of widows alive on their husband's pyre. To refuse was to invite lifelong disgrace. To comply was celebrated as purity. Accounts describe crowds chanting as flames consumed the widow, her body collapsing while priests proclaimed her soul ascended. It was theater, meant to terrify the living. Parents, desperate to shield their daughters, sometimes turned to mutilation. Chronicles speak of fathers scarring their children, breaking teeth, or even blinding them to make them undesirable to invaders. Such acts were not born of cruelty, but of a twisted love. A maimed daughter alive, then a beautiful one enslaved. Communities reorganized around fear. Marriage ages dropped lower and lower. Girls wed before puberty, not out of piety, but survival. This is where the system revealed its true genius. It made its victims complicit. Mothers-in-law became enforcers, watching brides with hawk-like vigilance. Priests who claimed to protect virtue became regulators of desire. Families themselves upheld the very rules that crushed them, because breaking them meant ruin. The cycle was not chaos. It was calculation. And yet, despite the suffocating control, voices seep through the cracks of time. Poems whisper of women longing for freedom, of nights where intimacy was not duty but rebellion. Archaeological digs at temple sites reveal hidden graffiti scratched into stone, names, prayers, even curses. They are fragments of resistance, faint but enduring. But for the vast majority, the rules held. Bedrooms remained battlegrounds, and human intimacy, the spoils of empire. If the family and the temple were the front lines of control, the caste system was the iron frame that held the entire machinery together. Intimacy, in this vision of society, was not a matter of affection or private bonds. It was a fortress wall, a boundary policed with ferocity. The Manu Semriti decreed that a woman of higher caste found with a lower-born man could be executed, her body mutilated as public warning. The man, depending on his rank, might be burned alive or torn apart by dogs. Adultery was not only betrayal of a husband, it was contamination of the entire social order. Within these rules, women became both vessels of purity and instruments of terror. A young bride did not just carry her husband's name, she carried his caste. Every night she was watched, not always physically, but through the constant weight of fear. To falter was to risk the annihilation of her lineage. Families internalized this discipline, locking daughters in courtyards, never letting them step outside unchaperoned. Privacy was a luxury none could afford, because even the rumor of impropriety could destroy a household. The rules were euphemistically framed as dharma sacred duty. Priests preached that obedience in the bedroom preserved cosmic order, while defiance invited chaos. A woman refusing her husband was accused not of self-protection, but of threatening the balance of the universe. Such charges sound abstract, but their punishments were devastatingly real. A wife who withheld intimacy could be cast out, stripped of property, even sold as a slave. The logic was chilling. Her body was not her own. It was a public utility, serving family, caste, and God. Economic incentives kept the cycle alive. Ledgers from South Indian temples list women as donations alongside elephants and grain. These gifts enriched priestly institutions, which in turn legitimized the donors' families as pious and loyal. A father who could not afford taxes might surrender his daughter. A king might prove his devotion by dedicating hundreds of women as devotesses, cloaking sexual exploitation in the sanctity of worship. The Devadasi system became one of the most enduring examples of systematic dehumanization. Girls trained from childhood to sing, dance, and serve patrons, their bodies considered extensions of the deity. Archaeological digs at temple complexes like Hampi reveal living quarters specifically built for these women, positioned near sanctuaries but marked with iron restraints. Even conquest was filtered through this logic. Victorious kings paraded not only captured elephants or treasure, but also captured women. Court chronicles describe lines of wives and concubines marched like spoils of war, their identities erased, their futures decided by royal whim. Inscriptions boast of numbers: 500 maidens given in tribute. They are reduced to statistics, their individuality annihilated in the language of record-keeping. And behind every number lay countless untold stories of severed families, broken communities, silenced lives. Transport itself became a horror. Caravans of women moved as if they were cargo. Chronicles note mortality rates with bureaucratic detachment. Of the 125 perished from exhaustion. These journeys were designed not just to deliver bodies, but to crush spirits. Survivors arrived malnourished, scarred, and submissive, perfect candidates for integration into harems or temple service. Psychological warfare was as deliberate as physical domination. Widows remained the ultimate cautionary tale. Stripped of color and joy, they were condemned to a half-life, their very presence treated as contamination. Some accounts describe villagers forbidding widows from attending festivals or weddings, as though their grief were a disease that could spread. It was no accident, it was pedagogy. By making examples of widows, society instilled terror in brides-to-be. The lesson was clear: devotion had no limit, and love offered no refuge. Resistance did exist, but it often came at unimaginable cost. A woman who dared to seek another partner could be disfigured. Communities that defied caste-based marriage rules might face raids, their houses burned. Stories circulated of mothers poisoning their daughters rather than handing them over to invaders. Inscriptions record villages where entire populations fled into forests to escape tribute demands in women. These acts of desperation are not footnotes, they are evidence of how systematic the oppression was, that even annihilation seemed preferable to compliance. And still, the cycle endured because it was normalized. Children grew up watching their mothers submit, their sisters silenced, their grandmothers erased. What began as fear hardened into tradition, reinforced by law and sanctified by religion. A boy raised in such a system learned early that his bride was his property. A girl learned that her body was her duty. And both believed the system was natural, inevitable, divine. The cruelty was not only in what was done, but in how it was remembered or forgotten. The poetry of Kalidasa sings of celestial love, while inscriptions in the same era list women donated to temples as though they were sacks of rice. The contrast is staggering. The golden age of literature and philosophy coexisted with the industrial-scale dehumanization of half the population. Intimacy was weaponized, joy was regulated, and desire was treated as a taxable commodity. Contemporary chroniclers often disguised the reality in euphemisms. They wrote of gifts, flowers, devotions, but archaeological remains strip away the pretense. Iron shackles unearthed at temple complexes, inscriptions detailing quotas of women alongside cattle, manuscripts prescribing punishments that read less like moral guidance and more like military code. These fragments exposed the truth. The rules of the bedroom were not accidents of culture. They were pillars of empire. Pause and consider the scale. Millions of women, over centuries, lived under this system. Every night was a performance judged by family, by caste, by God. Every misstep risked ruin. Intimacy, the one realm we imagine private, tender, safe, was transformed into a battlefield of surveillance and punishment. And from that battlefield rose the glory of empires we still admire for their art, their philosophy, their science. It is here, in this collision of beauty and brutality, that the true horror begins to reveal itself. For what these societies built with one hand, they destroyed with the other. Their mathematics measured the stars, their ledgers measured women. Their poets sang of eternal love, their laws chained love in iron. Their temples reached for the heavens, their bedrooms became prisons. This is the paradox that fuels our fascination, the shadow that history prefers to forget. But the records remain, etched in stone and ink, awaiting those willing to confront them. And as we peel back the layers, one truth becomes undeniable. The rules of intimacy in ancient India were not quirks of culture. They were a system deliberate, calculated, and devastating in its reach. By now, the outlines of the nightmare are clear, intimacy monitored, women reduced to ledgers, purity weaponized as social control. But the true horror lay not only in isolated customs or family rules. It lay in the scale, in the deliberate architecture that turned private lives into the gears of an empire-wide machine. This machine had one purpose above all: preservation of hierarchy. Caste purity was not an abstract principle, but an obsession that justified violence with the authority of heaven. Laws codified who could touch whom, when, and how. If a man of lower caste so much as glanced too long at a high-born woman, the penalty could be death. If a woman strayed, willingly or not, her body bore the punishment while the man's culpability was minimized. This was not passion misdirected. It was systematic, codified in texts like the Manusmriti with terrifying clarity. The Arthashastra reveals just how cold the calculations could be. Kautilya advised kings to deploy spies disguised as lovers, seducing women of rival courts to test loyalty and expose weakness. Intimacy itself became espionage. Failure of a queen or concubine to resist temptation was not a personal lapse, but political treason. The state weaponized desire as a tool of control, creating a culture where even affection was suspect. And then came the breeding logic. Dynasties rose and fell on the ability to produce heirs, and so the science of reproduction became its own grim bureaucracy. The timing of intimacy was regulated by priests consulting lunar calendars, prescribing nights when conception was deemed auspicious. A woman's body was reduced to a field, tilled and measured by men who claimed divine sanction. If a child of the wrong caste pairing emerged, the consequences were catastrophic. Infants could be killed, mothers exiled, entire families ruined. The mathematics of cruelty is recorded in chilling numbers. Chroniclers note that to secure 100 suitable wives or concubines, thousands of girls might be taken, inspected, and discarded. 9 of 10 might be rejected, abused, or lost in transport. The losses were written off as acceptable, as though human lives were no more than livestock culled for breeding. This was efficiency, stripped of empathy. Even justice became theater, staged with intimacy at its center. Trials of adultery or chastity violations were conducted in public squares. A suspected woman might be forced to undergo ordeal by firewalking across burning coals or holding red-hot iron. Survival was seen as proof of purity, failure as divine condemnation. Crowds gathered, jeering, chanting, turning one woman's pain into a civic spectacle. What should have been love's sanctuary became a circus of humiliation. Religion lent its seal at every step. Priests declared that obedience to bedroom rules upheld cosmic balance. Defiance, they warned, would bring famine or plague. The gods themselves were imagined as enforcers, their wrath descending on families that allowed women to stray. This theology made resistance unthinkable. To rebel was not merely to defy society, but to risk cosmic catastrophe. The result was a feedback loop of fear. Women internalized their chains, men enforced them as sacred duty, and communities perpetuated the cycle generation after generation. Pause and imagine the weight of this machine. For a young bride, every gesture was haunted by law, every touch overseen by custom, every silence interpreted by scripture. Intimacy was stripped of tenderness, transformed into a test she could never truly pass. For centuries, millions of lives turned in this gearwork of domination. And yet, the machine demanded more. It did not only police the present, it planned for the future. The machine did not simply control a single generation. It replicated itself, embedding its logic so deeply that even victims became enforcers. Mothers who once wept at their own surveillance turned into guardians of the same rules for their daughters. Fathers who feared losing family honor arranged marriages for girls scarcely old enough to speak in full sentences. What began as chains imposed from outside hardened into expectations carried from within. The seasonal rhythms of empire were planned around it. Scouts did not merely survey crops or roads, they mapped villages for the number of marriageable girls. Raids were scheduled with agricultural cycles, the hunger for human tribute as predictable as the harvest. In some chronicles, tribute lists distinguish between grain, cattle, and maidens, with the same bureaucratic precision. It was all one economy, one system of extraction. Even law codes reflected this terrifying arithmetic. A woman violated was not recognized as a victim, but as damaged property. Compensation was calculated not in terms of her suffering, but in terms of her owner's loss. The euphemism, fines for property damage, hid unspeakable crimes. Intimacy was thus stripped of humanity and reduced to a ledger entry, its pain transformed into revenue. And society absorbed this logic. Public festivals sometimes included parades where women accused of infidelity were displayed as examples, their humiliation turned into entertainment. Children watched, absorbing the message that obedience was survival. The cruelty was not hidden. It was showcased, a spectacle to remind everyone that the system reached into the most private of moments. The chilling irony is that these practices were celebrated as moral triumphs. In epic poems, kings boasted of their control over women as proof of cosmic order. Priests praised the devotion of widows who chose, or were forced into sati, burning on the pyre. Communities honored the father who offered his daughter to a temple, rebranding desperation as generosity. The system disguised horror in the language of virtue, ensuring it could reproduce without challenge. Normalization was perhaps its most devastating victory. After centuries, intimacy itself was redefined. Love became indistinguishable from duty. Desire was twisted into obedience. Even resistance seemed impossible, for to break the rules was not merely rebellion against family, but blasphemy against gods and betrayal of caste. The machine had done its work so thoroughly that entire societies could not imagine intimacy free of surveillance. Pause for a moment. Entire villages surrendered at the mere whisper of what awaited their daughters. Parents mutilated children in desperate love. Communities erased joy from their rituals to prove their loyalty. And all of it was considered order, justice, the natural way of things. What began as rules became destiny. What began as surveillance became culture. This was the machine of empire, the most intimate battlefield, where human bonds were dismantled and rebuilt as instruments of control. It is here, at the height of its power, that we glimpse the darkest truth. When civilizations glorified as golden ages are stripped of their poetry, we see how their glory was financed by chains laid in bedrooms, by silenced voices, by the systematic reduction of intimacy into law and ledger. When we step back from the details, the ledgers, the punishments, the spectacles, we see a civilization that dazzled the world with poetry, mathematics, and architecture, yet tethered its brilliance to chains in the most private of spaces. Ancient India's golden ages were not only built on temples that soared toward heaven or universities that catalogued the stars. They were also built on rules that stripped intimacy of safety, transforming the bedroom into a stage for law, caste, and power. The fragility of civilization lies here. The same society that produced timeless art also normalized cruelty so deep that victims themselves carried it forward. Mothers shaved their heads in widowhood because law demanded it. Fathers handed daughters to temples because tax burdens forced it. Husbands measured devotion not in love but in obedience. The brilliance of empire and the brutality of its rules were not opposites. They were twins, born of the same order, and the echoes remain. In some communities, widowhood rituals linger like scars of a vanished age. In social memory, the fear of female autonomy persists, shadowed by the ancient doctrine that a woman must never be independent. Genetic studies trace the intermingling of populations across caste lines, silent witnesses to the transgressions that law sought to erase. These are not just ghosts of the past, they are fingerprints pressed into the present. The archives endure, too. Inscriptions carved in stone, manuscripts copied by hand, foreign chronicles preserved in distant libraries. They all tell us what happened in those chambers where love was meant to dwell. They reveal how power, unchecked, seeps into the most sacred human bonds until even tenderness becomes a weapon. They remind us that civilization is not measured only by what it creates, but also by what it tolerates. To remember is to resist forgetting, to give dignity back to those who lived and died under rules they did not choose. Their voices are faint, but in telling their stories, we ensure they are not erased twice. If this history unsettles you, if it makes you wonder what other shadows still lie buried, then join me in unearthing them. Subscribe, and share in the comments what struck you most, because the more we confront the buried truths of history, the less likely they are to repeat. Together, we can hold up the mirror that empire tried so hard to shatter.